If you ask a comic book fan what Batman stories immediately come to mind, there's a few answers you're likely to get. The Killing Joke, Death in the Family, Arkham Asylum, but arguably the most significant one of the bunch is Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, the tale of an older, past his prime Batman returning to crime fighting after a 10-year absence, encountering allies and enemies both old and new, and culminating in a final battle against his former partner, Superman. So many pieces of Batman media released in the last 40 years or so have taken inspiration from this book in one way or another, to the point where many modern iconic aspects of Batman can be traced back to this book. It was also the inspiration for Comic Sans, but hey, you take the good with the bad. When a story ends up having this much of an impact on a franchise like this, it can result in not only a lot of nods and references, but also a number of full-on adaptations. But when so many different interpretations of the same story exist, each with different circumstances surrounding their creation, that can mean that each version of it can end up being wildly different from each other. So what I want to do with this video is look at 3 different versions of The Dark Knight Returns, try to see how they differ from the comic, how they differ from each other, and try to see what the actual reason for those changes appear to be. I think it's best we start small by looking at Batman the Animated Series. You might be wondering why I'm bringing this show up. After all, the series itself is not an adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns and is very much its own thing. In fact, it's arguably just as influential in its own right. Well, that's mostly true except for one episode titled Legends of the Dark Knight. This episode features very little of Batman as we know him in the show, and instead focuses on a group of kids wandering the streets of Gotham, swapping stories on who or what Batman is. One sees him as a supernatural monster.
He's like a giant pterodactyl beast with big fangs and talons.
One sees him as a colorful, campy hero.
Well done, old chum.
And one who just so happens to be a girl with glasses and short red hair, sees him as a brooding and aggressive old man, taking on a criminal uprising in the seediest areas of Gotham City.
Back off, man, I'll waste it. Believe me, I'll do it.
I believe you.
So to get to the most immediately obvious change from the comic, this is a much more simplified version of the story. It's a 5-minute segment of a 20-minute TV episode, adapting a nearly 200-page graphic novel, so it needs to focus on elements of the story that are instantly recognizable and unmistakably based on the book. So the segment mainly adapts 2 scenes from the second chapter, focusing on Batman's fight against the Mutant Gang, a criminal group created specifically for this comic.
I myself will kill the fool Batman. Gotham City belongs to the mutants!
Personally, I'm glad that this is the element of the comic that they chose to adapt, not only because it's recognizable, but also because this was my personal favorite part of the story, and I think it makes the best use of the premise. Batman in the original comic has to contend with the fact that he's older and can't win a fight with sheer brutality like he used to. We see this in his first fight against the mutant leader, who's younger and fitter, overpowering Batman and nearly killing him. This causes Batman to rethink his tactics, realizing that he can't match the leader's physicality, but can fight smarter than him. During the rematch, he lures the leader to fight in a mud pit to slow him down, he cuts him on the forehead, making him bleed into his eyes to blind him, he uses nerve techniques to put the leader's arm to sleep. The leader still gets off a few good hits, but Batman ultimately proves to him and his gang that there are some qualities more valuable than senseless violence. It's a genuinely inspiring moment about how even if you have weaknesses or don't have the same advantages as other people, you can still match or even outdo them if you think outside the box. In Legends of the Dark Knight, a lot of that is cut down for time. They obviously can't afford a whole storyline of Batman confronting the mutants, then failing, then retreating, then going back to fight them again in the 5 minutes the segment has. Instead, the segment combines these 2 encounters into one and focuses less on capturing the message of the story and more the vibes. The Dark Knight Returns is a really good comic, but I wouldn't really recommend it as someone's first Batman story, mainly because it's quite tonally different from what we traditionally associate with Batman. It's a lot more dingy and violent than other takes, and that seems to be knowingly communicated by having the segment be an in-universe fictional story from someone in a much more traditional DC continuity. Batman the Animated Series does show Batman fighting bad guys and such, but also typically focuses more on the emotional side of the character. This segment sets itself apart in a huge way, with Batman rolling into battle in a giant tank and wrestling a simple-minded brute who kills and terrorizes for the love of it. We can also see this angle with the choice of voice actor. Batman in the animated series was iconically played by Kevin Conroy, arguably the default Batman actor for his ability to balance the darkness and also emotional range of the character.
I know I made a promise, but I didn't see this coming. I didn't count on being happy.
This segment, however, features fucking Darkseid's voice actor Michael Ironside, who gives the character a much more unsympathetic and threatening performance than we're used to from this show.
It's an operating table. And I'm the surgeon.
Speaking of sound, that leads into one element that the showrunners obviously have to make from scratch, the music. And this is something where the showrunners are in a bit of a unique situation. It's not enough for it to just be music that suits the story they're adapting. It also has to sound distinct from the very iconic style of music present in the rest of the show. You know, the moody but triumphant orchestral score that we've come to expect from Batman. And so the direction they go with is to lean into the seedy aggressiveness of the story and have Batman be accompanied by distorted rock music. I'll give credit, this is a choice that manages to feel separate from the more standard Batman music, while still being an accurate reflection of the story it's adapting. Since this is a somewhat more brutal Batman, and the mutants appear to take a lot of cues from punk aesthetics, it's a musical choice that really fits. Interestingly enough, it's something that would end up becoming kind of a staple in adaptations of Frank Miller's work. Whether that segment is what inspired that going forward, I doubt it, but it is impressive just how ahead of the curve it was. The episode as a whole ends with the kids finishing their stories and running into the actual Batman in action, and after finally seeing what he's really like, the episode finishes with the kids debating over whose version was closest to the real thing.
See? He was just like I said. What are you talking about? Did you see the way he fought? I'm telling you, he's not human.
And from a meta perspective, this ending shows how these alternate versions might take liberties with the material, but they're still part of what makes Batman Batman. He is mysterious and larger than life. He is campy and funny, and like The Dark Knight Returns, he is dark and intimidating. This episode is far from a complete adaptation of the graphic novel, but it's not supposed to be. Instead, it's a love letter to how that graphic novel differs from typical Batman, but also still understands it. But as adaptations go, this is fairly minimalistic, so next I'm going to take a look at something a bit more thorough. In 2012 and 2013, we saw the release of a two-part direct-to-video animated film based on The Dark Knight Returns' story in its entirety. The film as a whole is pretty close to the comic, with elements like the general art style, sequence of events, and dialogue recreated pretty closely.
Back off or I'll kill him! Believe me, man, I'll do it!
I believe you.
The main change I notice is that compared to the comic, the movie is generally more fast-paced. The comic dedicated a lot of attention to narration, mainly from Batman, but also occasionally from other characters as well. The movie leaves a lot of that out, meaning that a lot of these scenes play out much quicker than the sequences they're directly taking from. For example, this specific page from the comic gets adapted into the movie. In the comic, this image is accompanied by a whole 6 blocks of narration from Batman. This should be agony. I should be a mass of aching muscle, broken, spent, unable to move. And were I an older man, I surely would. But I'm a man of 30, of 20 again. The rain on my chest is a baptism. I'm born again. And here's that moment as it appears in the movie. That's it. It's surprising to see the movie not utilize the inner monologue, seeing as how it's a pretty signature part of Frank Miller's work, but it's not necessarily a bad choice. I imagine it was probably done, at least partially, because it has to adapt the entire story into a 2.5-hour runtime, but given the transition to a new medium, a lot of the information conveyed by the narration is filled in through other ways. For example, that passage I just read is meant to communicate Batman's return after a 10-year absence, that after all that time away feeling old and useless, he now feels invigorated and full of purpose for the first time in a decade. In the movie, that same information is instead communicated through elements like the fast-paced animation and the uplifting and exciting music, two elements that the original comic couldn't include, so instead played to the strengths of its own medium. Speaking of music, it's interesting looking at this movie directly after watching Legends of the Dark Knight. While the Dark Knight Returns segment in that episode had to deliberately differentiate itself from the rest of the animated series, this movie exists basically in isolation, and because of that, it takes a lot more cues from more traditional Batman media with a more theatrical score. As an adaptation of the whole comic, it's a pretty good recreation of the story, but it does come with the downside that Legends of the Dark Knight didn't. The fact that it adapts the entire story and does it pretty damn faithfully, it also comes with a lot of the same problems. The plot of the graphic novel felt very segmented, which in a way makes sense since it was originally released as a miniseries, with each chapter covering its own mini-adventure, but it isn't the most helpful at creating a coherent overall story arc since each segment is treated pretty separately. This is something I could be okay with, but the stories don't exactly have equal importance in the overall narrative. In terms of what's actually important to the story, all the book really needed was Batman taking down the mutant gang and have his return start an uprising leading to his battle with Superman. Those are really the only two aspects of the plot that build off one another and have a good reason to be part of the same story. Aside from that, though, you've got additional storylines of Batman fighting a recently reformed and then relapsed Two-Face and his final battle with the Joker. Like, I get why they're here. Two-Face exists as a parallel to Batman in the sense that, just like how Bruce Wayne couldn't suppress his alter ego, neither could Harvey Dent.
Nothing can change what I am. You and me both.
And for the Joker, there is the idea that since this is a much older Batman, it's thematically appropriate that he has his final encounter with his arch nemesis. But neither of these characters do much to advance the plot. Two-Face doesn't contribute to Batman coming out of retirement, that's all the mutants, and he's never mentioned again after the first chapter. And the Joker ends his life, framing Batman for his death, which is interesting on paper, especially in a story about public and police perception on Batman, but it doesn't amount to anything. The Joker's death is never shown to affect public opinion, and the police were already hunting Batman, so this doesn't actually shift how they behave towards him. This is the biggest issue with the movie. It sets out to be a faithful adaptation, and definitely succeeds in that regard, but it doesn't really expand on the parts of the source material that could have actually used some improvement. Oh, and this is a nitpick, but there's this one scene where you can see a bunch of DC comics like Sandman and V for Vendetta. It's a cute Easter egg, but one of the books they include is Watchmen, which is a little weird considering that in the Watchmen universe, both the comic and the movie, which came out before this one, Batman is explicitly shown to be a fictional character. I demand perfect logic from my silly little Easter eggs, damn it. Still though, it's a very good take in the story, and when comparing it to Legends of the Dark Knight, I think it's honestly pretty interesting. That segment was more focused on accentuating how different the original comic was from the rest of the franchise, whereas this movie, being a more self-contained and narrative-driven plot, is instead focused on presenting the story through the lens of it just being a Batman movie first and foremost. It's a case where one adaptation is more focused on adapting the tone of the source material, while another adapts the story and themes, but both versions work. But while this would be the movie to directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns, we would still see other media take inspiration from it, including one that I think is close enough to say it's based on, even if it is fairly loose about it. That movie being Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Every movie review and video essay channel on YouTube has had their own take on BVS. Some positive, some negative, some negative, some negative, some negative, including me back in a month ago. Batman v Superman, though, is one of the worst superhero movies ever made. Boy, I'm really running out of ideas here. But if there is something relatively untalked about, as far as I can tell anyway, it's that as bad as this movie is, as an adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, it's actually kind of fascinating in a way. The plot vaguely follows certain aspects of the comic, the battle between Batman and Superman obviously, and also some visual similarities, public controversy surrounding these incredibly powerful and disruptive people, and certain lines of dialogue.
I'll kill her! Believe me, I'll do it!
I believe you.
But all of it is put in a completely different story, and so a lot of those elements, no matter how closely they resemble the original, get completely recontextualized. And what's doubly interesting is that while I can't confirm if this was deliberate, a lot of the changes made to the movie seem to be responses to the criticism that The Dark Knight Returns has received over the years. A number of people have criticized the book for the somewhat more unsympathetic and authoritarian depiction of Batman. He's more sadistic than normal, stands against the US government, and eventually puts together his own army that he refers to as soldiers. And while the book does feature some pushback towards him, some of it from more reasonable people than others, the story ultimately and very unambiguously sides with Batman, asserting that his methods and worldview are justified and that everyone else's, including DC's own Golden Boy Superman, are either too corrupt, misguided, or cowardly to stand with him. We see some of that in BVS, with Ben Affleck's Batman having more extreme methods. But the difference is that while Returns depicted this style of Batman as a hero fighting for what's right when nobody else was willing to, in BVS, up until the last third anyway, Batman is kind of the villain. The movie shows him torturing and mutilating criminals, and there is debate from Gotham about the ethics of him doing this, but the film is very clear in communicating that Batman is going too far.
The feeling of powerlessness that turns good men cruel.
And this is something that bleeds into Bruce Wayne's personal life, which also differs from Returns. In the book, Bruce coming back to his role of Batman is treated as him finding a new lease on life, finally feeling inspired and youthful again after 10 years of feeling old and past his purpose. In BVS, we instead see a Batman who never retired, but the years have not been kind. 20 years of fighting crime in Gotham and feeling that he's got nothing to show for it. His friends and allies have either died or turned on him, his city is still just as crime-ridden as ever, and he's become a broken, cynical, and lonely old man who feels that his entire life's work has been meaningless.
Criminals are like weeds, Alfred. Pull one up, another grows in its place.
This is no longer the inspiring story of a man reclaiming his sense of self and making the world better as a result. This is instead a tragic story of a man whose morality and faith in his cause has been slowly eroded by a cruel and uncaring world, and is now resorting to more unsavory tactics out of sheer frustration and desperation. And you can especially see that contrast in scenes that almost directly quote lines from the book, but in such a way where it's clear you're not intended to side with him.
My parents taught me a different lesson. Dying in the gutter for no reason at all. They taught me the world only makes sense if you force it to.
You can even see this in his interactions with Alfred, who, despite the rest of the movie's problems, is just straight up better than he is in the comic. Alfred is barely present in the book. He goes along with Batman's escapades, but rarely demonstrates any agency or contribution to the plot. In BVS, we get a lot of Alfred's signature sarcastic wit, which has traditionally been used as a way of acknowledging the absurdity of what Batman does, and can also be construed as a coping mechanism for the harm his surrogate son puts himself through.
Firefly burns on 90% of his body. His obsession is going to be his end.
How unlike anyone I know.
In BVS, though, Alfred's sarcasm comes off as more bitter than usual. Like, he's genuinely frustrated and concerned about the dark path Bruce is going down and feels powerless to stop it.
I hope the next generation of Waynes won't inherit an empty wine cellar. Not that there's likely to be a next generation.
The movie's depiction of Superman also feels like a response to criticism for Returns. One of the other main complaints of the book is the fact that it takes Superman, one of the most definitively hopeful and compassionate superheroes of all time, and interprets him as a pawn of a corrupt US government who lacks the agency to think for himself and just blindly listens to authority. In BVS, however, as much as people complain about Zack Snyder's Superman for lacking the more inspiring traits we all love about him, there is at least more of an attempt to capture that in this movie than there is in Returns. In this movie, Superman isn't taking orders from the US government. In fact, a significant portion of the government see him as a bit of a wild card.
I'm not saying he shouldn't act. I'm saying he shouldn't act unilaterally.
Instead, Superman is just depicted as an ordinary guy at heart who's trying to do the right thing but is unsure of how to go about it.
Maybe he's not some sort of devil or Jesus character. Maybe he's just a guy trying to do the right thing.
There's a lot here that could have potentially made this one of the most revolutionary adaptations of all time. Sure, you've got Legends of the Dark Knight, which celebrated how different the source material was from the norm, and you've got the Dark Knight Returns movies, which celebrated the source material just as a story, but this could be considered a case where the adaptation outright challenges the original material, serving as both an alternate take and an analysis of it in and of itself. Unfortunately, while the ideas are there, this movie still sucks. For a movie that is 2.5 hours long, 3 hours if you want the full experience, the movie has basically nothing to say about any of the complex themes it brings up. The movie talks about what Batman and Superman should and shouldn't do, but it never explores any of it. The two never change or adapt their methods over the course of the story, and the actual resolutions don't address any of the questions that were raised throughout the film. The question of what are reasonable restrictions and precautions to place upon someone who has the power to destroy the world is ultimately answered with, who cares? Isn't it nice that he loves his mom?
Save Martha!
And look how well that ultimately turned out. The worldwide debate about whether Superman causes too much collateral damage is resolved with him sacrificing his life to save the world. And yeah, it means that half the world stops hating him, but it doesn't actually answer the question of how much of the damage he caused was justified. This isn't a question that the movie satisfyingly answers, it's a question that just becomes irrelevant because Superman dies. And even if the movie wants to use that as an excuse, he comes back to life in Justice League anyway. Still though, it's interesting to see how one story can be adapted so many different times in vastly different ways. Yeah, each of them have their pros and cons, but even at their worst, they can make you view the original material in a way that you may have never even considered before. And these are just 3 of many Batman stories that have drawn from The Dark Knight Returns over the years. There are so many others that currently exist and no doubt will continue to spring up in the future. One possible future adaptation that I think is particularly noteworthy, if pretty unlikely, actually comes from our good buddy Zack. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Snyder talked about the possibility of returning to DC now that his own attempt at that universe has bit the dust. He said that he'd consider coming back if he got to direct a straightforward adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns. And as someone who has vocally voiced his disdain for Batman v Superman in multiple videos, I would love to see that. We've seen in the past that some of Snyder's best movies have been faithful adaptations of graphic novels, and if 300 is any indication, Frank Miller's style of writing is a great match for Snyder's approach as a director. I doubt it'll ever happen, but imagine if we got a live-action Returns film directed in the same vein as 300 or Watchmen. In fact, you know who I could see playing Batman in that movie? Jeffrey Dean Morgan. I mean, he's worked with Snyder already more than once, is roughly the right age, and looks like this version of the character. But however people choose to adapt The Dark Knight Returns going forward, if what we've seen so far is any indication, I'm excited to see what Billy Berserk ideas they come up with next. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed, Zelda, Moon Goddesses, Blueberry Cello, Seth M, Chris Spicer, Jacob K, and Bluey. Thank you so much for the support. If you'd like to see your name in the credits, along with early access to scripts and videos, as well as exclusive unused video thumbnails, or if you'd just like to chat with me, consider supporting me on Patreon for just $1.50 a month. The link is in the description.